We would like to take this time right now to take you through the process of all the resources that are provided for a Engage lesson. First and foremost, what you are looking at here are PowerPoint slides for an Engage lesson. There is a PowerPoint presentation that can serve as a teacher lesson plan template, as well as a traditional teacher lesson plan template in a Microsoft Word document. What might this part of a module look like when planning and designing instruction? Well, first to start off, we need to realize that this lesson will probably take 2 days. The first day, you would take students through a process called the question formulation activity technique. And then on the second day, you would contextualize, tell a brief story to hook students, and then allow students to reflect. You would here first provide knowledge standards of what do students need to know in order to be successful with this module, and also how you will address it if they are not successful. What types of activities or tasks would we adhere to if they're not successful? And then you would do the same thing here for which skill standards. So it's important to outline first and foremost which knowledge standards and which skill standards we are addressing within the curriculum before planning the lesson. Then we would, in this slide here, put a question focus. In other words, this part here is usually a important visual that's aligned to the standards that we are teaching, or a map or cartoon or video clip. It could be anything that really is going to stimulate student thinking in the slide, in which you want to formulate and facilitate students through the process of beginning to ask their own questions by looking at a particular stimulus or visual or map or cartoon, like we said. This can be done in class, or for distance learning can be done in a video conferencing session with students in a whole group. You'll note that the following slides that we are about to go through here, in slides 3 through 21, are for teacher notes, and teachers should revise them accordingly for student presentation. We begin by identifying what is the question formulation technique. It's simple. It's a rigorous step-by-step process designed to help students produce and improve and strategize on how to use their questions by looking at something that really gets their thinking going. It allows also students to practice 3 thinking abilities in one process: the idea of divergent thinking, convergent thinking, and metacognitive thinking. Students can use their questions for many purposes after they've developed them in these activities. We could use all the questions that the students develop to conduct research, to create reports, to conduct certain experiments, to conduct independent projects. We could also use the questions that are developed within these activities as writing tasks, group and individual projects, Socratic seminars or debates, or to prepare for presentations or other interviews. So when you formulate the questions in this activity, these questions could actually be used throughout a unit to teach other lessons and for other tasks and activities. The components of the question formulation technique are as follows. First, students engage in the question focus. Then we transition into the rules for producing questions. Then students produce questions and categorize them, and then prioritize them, figure out their next best steps on what to do with those questions, and then go through a reflection process. The question formulation technique really should accomplish one or more of the following items here. Rather, to completely generate interest, to stimulate new thinking, like we said, to introduce a new topic, maybe to set the learning agenda. This is your huge hook for the particular module that you're about to embark on or a unit of study, and to deepen comprehension. It also can be used as a form of formative assessment. The question focus, in other words, the stimulus that you're giving, whether it be a picture or a cartoon or a map or a video clip, like we said, should definitely be very brief and provoke or stimulate new lines of thinking. This should be the end-all, be-all, awesome, ultimate hook for a unit of study in social studies. The question focus should not be a question itself. Too many times we see practitioners utilize an open-ended question as a DIN assignment, and that just leads to students not being guided through a rigorous process of developing their own questions. To design your question focus, you're going to want to define the purpose first and foremost. What's your purpose of the question focus? Like we said, usually it's to introduce a particular topic or hook kids in a particular topic of study. To think about what students will do with the questions once they produce them, and to generate several focused question ideas. To check against a certain set of criteria that you've established for this, and to choose an idea that best meets your purpose and that criteria. Really, a tip here that we have here is to use a simple question focus to introduce your students to the question formulation process. Once you have that question focus, you'll be ready to give your students, to guide your students through the QFT steps, and they will produce their own questions, improve them, and strategize on how to use their questions themselves. The rules for producing questions are as follows. 1, ask as many questions as you can by looking at the stimulus that is stimulating your thinking. Do not stop to answer any of the questions. Judge or discuss the questions with your group, or if you're doing this as whole group or you've divided kids into several smaller groups. Then write down every question exactly as it is stated, and then change any statement into a question. You know, the challenge here is if we have to be in distance learning, then if a teacher has to be in distance learning, they could conduct this through a video conferencing application such as Zoom or Microsoft Teams, and do this in whole group and have students list questions in the chat section of the conferencing to develop questions as a whole group, as a whole class. At this point, though, this is much easier to do by dividing kids into smaller groups within the classroom. And if you do that, you can ask students to review the rules, ask students to reflect about one of these following questions. What do you think would be difficult about following these rules, and which one of these rules might be difficult to follow and why? Usually, students get trapped into rule number 2, which is do not stop to answer, judge, or discuss the questions. Once students have discussed the rules for producing the questions, you would divide students into small groups of 3 to 5. Again, if you are doing distance learning, you could get really creative and go into different chat rooms. You could ask groups to identify a note taker for each group. You would distribute newsprint or worksheets to each of the small groups. And if done in distance learning format, you need to alter the activity, obviously, like we said, to a whole group activity or divide students into different video conferencing groups. You would then introduce the question focus and ask students to produce as many questions as they can in the allotted time. You would follow the rules for producing the questions. You would number the questions, and the note takers should also be contributing to questions in the process. Then you would define for students before transitioning into this part of the question formulation technique task, you would provide the following before categorizing questions, asking students to categorize the questions. You need to define what close-ended questions are and what open-ended questions are. And usually we know that close-ended questions can be answered with a yes or a no, or with a one-word answer. And then open-ended questions require more explanation. So we really want students to identify what are closed-ended questions and what are open-ended questions, because those open-ended questions might actually end up being questions for your other lessons within the unit of study that you're about to embark on. You need to ask students to look over their list once they've developed the questions and mark the questions that are closed-ended with a C and mark the questions that are open-ended with an O. And then you would ask students to name, advantages of closed-ended questions and then disadvantages of closed-ended questions, and then go through the same process of with open-ended questions. What are the advantages of open-ended questions and the disadvantages of open-ended questions? And please note here that obviously both types of questions are very useful. There are times in which open-ended questions are more useful and other times where you need close-ended questions. Usually those open-ended questions really serve as great compelling questions in larger writing task assignments for writing lessons. Ask students to practice changing questions from one type to another. Like you could choose one closed-ended question from your list and change it into an open-ended and vice versa. And then you would prioritize the questions. The criteria here for prioritizing is usually set by the teacher. The criteria will deepen on what you have planned as next steps with the questions, and instructions for prioritization will vary. So here are some examples of what you could do with students to ask them to prioritize their questions. You could ask them to list the 3 most important questions that they find interesting, the ones that they consider to be the most important, the ones that will, help or design their research project or their experiment, or help them solve the problem that you want them to solve, or the larger inquiry of study, and then which ones they want or need to answer first. And this might guide you into your further lessons of study throughout the unit that you are planning. You need to ask students to review their list of questions and choose those 3 questions most important, or to develop a project, or like we said, which prioritizing criteria. Mark them with an X and remind students to keep the question focus in mind while prioritizing. Ask students to think about and share their rationale for choosing their priority questions. For example, why did you choose these 3 as the most important? And ask students to identify where are their priority questions in the sequence of the whole list of questions. Finally, ask students to share out loud. The questions have changed, some of the questions, they change from closed to open-ended and from open-ended to closed-ended. Ask them to read the original question, then read the new question. Ask them to list their priority questions and their reasons for choosing the priority questions, the numbers of the priority questions in the sequence from the entire list. And here, there's a tip that one group member can report, but others can join in. This truly allows a process of self-ownership of learning, taking responsibility, making responsible decisions within this process. It also promotes civic discourse within a social studies classroom. When students share the numbers of the priority questions, they'll notice in the sequence of the questions of the priorities were produced. And often students notice that the priority questions came from different places, either from the beginning or the middle or the end of the task. And that helps them to see the value of generating a lot of questions before choosing their priority questions. You need to ask students to pay attention to the numbers of the priority questions. And then the next best steps, you can ask students how they want to use their questions. They could use it for later writing. For example, this could be a question that they may want to answer in a larger essay, or actually, for starters, a claim evidence reasoning response, a CER response, or a constructed response question, or a document-based question essay, or an enduring issues essay, or even a small ticket out the door. They may want to use these questions for presentations that they're about to do, or for later research in larger group projects or debates or Socratic seminars. You could also ask students to decide how they will use their questions specifically. You don't have to guide them with a specific task that you want to assign them to as well. And then we ask students to reflect. What did you learn from the lesson? What is the value of learning? To ask your own questions. How can you use what you learned? And you could use one of these questions or more of these questions and ask them one question at a time. And then after the question formulation technique task itself, then you yourself, as the practitioner, this is where you transition into explicit direct instruction. It is really important here where the social studies teacher takes explicit direct instruction at this point in 1 or 2 slides, where you use a map visual here in this slide to set the geographic context of the topic being studied. So for example, if I'm studying Africa, I'm definitely going to put up a map of Africa, and I'm going to discuss the important geographic features that we are going to focus on while studying Africa. We're going to allow students to see and visualize their place in the world and the location being studied. You can use, obviously, digital technology such as GPS technology, Google Maps, and other tools to enhance this brief part of the lesson. Once you've established that geographic context, you will then build some chronological reasoning context to the situation or the topic that you have studied. This right here is a timeline template that you will alter in your instruction, and you will build your own timeline and series of events and icons that you can put into the PowerPoint slide, in which you develop a timeline to allow students to see where they are in the span of time that is being studied of the historical topic. It's also really important here to develop your own set of questions, either aligned to Bloom's taxonomy or Costa's higher level order thinking questions, in which you could start asking questions about the timeline and about the context of time in regards to the topic. You could also begin to introduce certain enduring issues or include questions about enduring issues based on what's being analyzed in the timeline. So again, this is just not showing a timeline. It's really diving into this slide based on the descriptions of certain events that you are putting within the timeline, how that impacts the greater, larger study of the unit, and then how that is also tied into the relevancy of today and the connections. You're going to make certain connections, or how enduring issues have endured across time all the way up to the present day in regards to the topic here. Then you will definitely tell a brief story. This, again, these final slides are final slides of direct instruction, but students need to acquire new content here for sufficient exposure. And here's where you tell a very interesting story, either in person or via your screencast in digital conferencing. You can develop a Screencastify if you're doing distance learning, but you can also introduce key content vocabulary here in this short story time if you wish, and be sure to be passionate with your story and hook students. Connect your story with the present day and the standards that you are teaching and the objectives that come along with this larger module that you are about to embark on. This really is the ultimate hook. This is the ultimate call to every social studies teacher to be extremely passionate and to really isolate a particular story of the historical period that they are covering or the social or cultural topic that they are discussing. Finally, you can have students also reflect and self-evaluate with particular exit tickets here. We have provided some examples for exit tickets that promote check for understandings, obviously, relevance, self-assessment, and definitely a work mindset for kids. So we just wanted to take you through the Engage lesson plan template, and then the other Engage lesson plan template here is provided for you in regards to in a traditional Microsoft Word format. You could also be using this format to plan your lessons. and type into the spaces where the descriptions are for each part of the lesson here in your lesson planning. The other part that we want to highlight here is the Ask Questions task. And so this is the task or graphic organizer that can be used for the question formulation technique. Students would obviously put their name and their period up at the top. They would name the document or the stimulus and the title of it and possibly the year that it was created if that information is available to them. And then here in the space here is where they provide and produce their questions. So that whole process that we just took you through the slides, this is where the students would actually ask as many questions as they can and write them down here in the process to share with the rest of the group. Then here we've outlined in step 2 the process that the students would go through and all the rules provided for them. And then we'd ask them to prioritize their 3 most important questions and choose and why, and explain why they think that they're most important. And then, of course, asking students to reflect here. And then on the back of the sheet is a self-awareness of learning where students will self-assess themselves on how they did on the question formulation technique, and then also a space for quick teacher feedback notes. This template was created on Microsoft PowerPoint specifically because it allowed us to be flexible with the margins in creating this task. You can, in distance learning, actually provide the students with the template from Microsoft PowerPoint and ask them to populate it from the Microsoft PowerPoint slide and then submit it that way to you on Canvas or the other digital platform that you happen to be using. So this is the Ask Questions task that's provided in the links as well on the website under the Engage Lessons materials. So we just wanted to take you through. Obviously, we have the slides here and the task that's in Microsoft PowerPoint for you. We also have the Microsoft Word lesson plan template and obviously the Ask Questions task that students can work on throughout the question formulation technique process. Providing other ways to take notes as far as the geographic context piece or the telling the story piece is up to the practitioner. We know that there are various ways that teachers and students take notes in class, and that can be provided and is up to the jurisdiction of the teacher and the students themselves. Thank you.